The newsroom of the Chicago Tribune buzzed with the familiar chaos of deadline day in September 1994. Typewriters clacking alongside the newer computer terminals, cigarette smoke still hanging in the air despite the new policies trying to ban it. Emma Harris sat at her cluttered desk, nursing her third cup of coffee and scanning through the day's mail when a particular envelope caught her attention. It was addressed to her specifically, handwritten in careful block letters, postmarked from Stateville Correctional Center. She'd received plenty of letters from inmates over her 8 years as an investigative journalist, most claiming innocence, most going straight to the trash after a cursory read. But something about this one made her pause. Maybe it was the precision of the handwriting or the weight of the paper inside, thick with what felt like documentation. She sliced open the envelope with her letter opener, a gift from her father before he died, and pulled out a stack of photocopied pages along with a handwritten letter. "Dear Ms. Harris," it began, "my name is John Carter. I have been incarcerated for 12 years for a murder I did not commit. I know you receive many such claims, but I am writing to you specifically because of your series on the Riverside 3. You showed that truth matters more than convenience. I am not asking you to believe me. I am only asking you to look at the evidence I've gathered, evidence that was never presented at my trial." Emma set down her coffee, her interest piqued. The Riverside 3 case had won her recognition 2 years ago when she'd exposed how 3 teenagers had been wrongfully convicted based on coerced confessions. The photocopies included police reports, witness statements, and most intriguingly, a timeline John had meticulously constructed showing his whereabouts on the night of March 15, 1982, when Rebecca Morrison, a 24-year-old graduate student, had been murdered in her Hyde Park apartment. Emma remembered the case vaguely. It had been sensational at the time. A young woman from a prominent family killed in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. John had been her neighbor, a maintenance worker at the building, and according to the letter, he'd been the convenient suspect when pressure mounted to solve the case quickly. His confession, he claimed, had come after 18 hours of interrogation without a lawyer present, and he'd recanted it immediately, but by then it was too late. Emma's editor, Bill Crawford, a veteran newsman with ink in his veins and a permanent scowl etched on his face, noticed her intense focus. "What's got you so absorbed, Harris?" he asked, approaching her desk with his characteristic heavy footsteps. She handed him the letter and watched his expression shift from skepticism to intrigue as he read. "Carter case," he muttered. "I remember this. Kid confessed. Seemed pretty straightforward." Emma pulled out one of the photocopied documents, a witness statement from a woman who claimed to have seen John at a bar miles away at the time of the murder, a statement that apparently never made it to trial. "Straightforward cases don't usually come with suppressed evidence, Bill," she said, already knowing she was going to dig into this. That evening, Emma sat in her Lincoln Park apartment. The city lights twinkling beyond her window, spread out before her, were all the documents John had sent, plus her own notes from a trip to the library to pull the original Tribune coverage of the Morrison murder. The more she read, the more inconsistencies she found. The timeline was the most glaring issue. According to the prosecution, John had killed Rebecca between 10 p.m. and midnight, but 3 separate witnesses placed him at O'Malley's bar until nearly 11:30, and the bar was a 20-minute drive from the apartment building in good traffic. The confession transcript, which John had somehow obtained, read like a textbook example of coercion, with leading questions and John's answers becoming increasingly desperate and contradictory as the hours wore on. Emma's phone rang, interrupting her concentration. It was her mother calling from Milwaukee for their weekly check-in. "You sound distracted, sweetheart," her mother said after a few minutes of conversation. Emma hadn't told her mother about the letter yet. She'd learned to be cautious about discussing her investigations, especially after what had happened to her father. Thomas Harris had been a police officer, a good one by all accounts, who'd tried to expose corruption in his department and had paid for it with his life, though officially it had been ruled a suicide. That was 7 years ago, and it was the reason Emma had become an investigative journalist in the first place. Every story about injustice, every corrupt official she exposed, it was all for him. The next morning, Emma drove out to Stateville, the massive prison complex rising like a concrete mountain from the flat Illinois prairie. The visitors' room smelled of industrial disinfectant and desperation, filled with families trying to maintain connections across scarred wooden tables. John Carter wasn't what she'd expected. At 35, he should have been in his prime, but 12 years inside had aged him considerably. His hair, premature grey at the temples, was neatly combed, and his prison-issue clothes were as clean and pressed as possible. But it was his eyes that struck her most, alert and intelligent, without the deadness she'd seen in so many lifers. "Thank you for coming," he said simply, his voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested how much this meeting meant to him. "I didn't think you would." They talked for the full hour allotted, John walking her through that night in 1982, with a clarity that suggested he'd relived it thousands of times. He'd been 23, working 2 jobs to pay for night school, hoping to become an electrician. He'd known Rebecca Morrison only in passing, had maybe spoken to her a dozen times in the 2 years they'd lived in the same building. The night she died, he'd been celebrating a friend's birthday at O'Malley's, had drunk too much, and had crashed at that friend's apartment, not returning home until the next afternoon to find the building swarming with police. "They needed someone," he said, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. The Morrison family had connections. The mayor was breathing down the department's neck, and I was perfect. Young black man, worked in the building, had access to all the apartments. The confession? I would have said anything to make it stop. They told me I could go home if I just told them what happened. I was young and stupid. I believed them. The Chicago Police Department's records building on South State Street hadn't been renovated since the 1960s, and it showed in every water-stained ceiling tile and flickering fluorescent light. Emma had spent 3 days navigating the bureaucratic maze required to access the Morrison case files, armed with Freedom of Information Act requests and sheer persistence. Detective Ray Kowalski, now retired, had agreed to meet her here, though his voice on the phone had been reluctant, weighted with something that might have been guilt or just weariness. She found him in the lobby, a man in his 60s with the look of someone who'd seen too much and drunk too much trying to forget it. His handshake was firm, but his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. "I remember you," he said. "The Riverside 3. You made us look like idiots." There was no real animosity in his voice, just a statement of fact. "Sometimes we are idiots," Emma replied, and was rewarded with a bark of laughter. They sat in a small viewing room while a clerk brought boxes of files, the dust making Emma sneeze. Kowalski watched her flip through police reports and crime scene photos with professional interest. "You really think we got the wrong guy?" he asked finally. Emma looked up from a witness statement she'd been reading, one that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. "I think there are enough questions that someone should have asked them 12 years ago," she said carefully. Kowalski was silent for a long moment, then pulled out a flask from his jacket, took a swig, and offered it to her. She declined. "I was the junior detective on the case," he said, his voice lower now. "Jim Bradley was lead. He's dead now, heart attack in 91. But I remember thinking the confession didn't feel right. Kid kept changing his story, not like he was lying, but like he was trying to figure out what we wanted to hear." The crime scene photos were brutal, even in black and white. Rebecca Morrison had been beaten and strangled, her apartment ransacked in what looked like a robbery, though her jewelry and wallet were still there. Emma noticed something in one of the photos, a detail that seemed odd. There was a cigarette butt in an ashtray on the coffee table, but according to John's statement and Rebecca's friends, neither of them smoked. She pointed this out to Kowalski, who frowned. Bradley said it was probably from earlier, maybe a visitor. We never tested it. DNA testing wasn't what it is now, and we had a confession. The more they went through the files, the more such oversights emerged. A neighbor had reported seeing a man she didn't recognize leaving the building around 11 p.m., but she'd only been interviewed once, briefly, after John's confession. Emma's investigation was starting to gain momentum, but it was also attracting attention. When she returned to the Tribune offices that afternoon, Bill Crawford pulled her into his office, closing the door behind them. "I got a call from the state's attorney's office," he said, without preamble. "They're not happy about you poking around the Morrison case. That was a high-profile conviction, Emma. The family has connections all the way to Springfield." Emma felt her jaw clench. This was exactly the kind of pressure that had derailed investigations before. "Are you telling me to stop?" she asked. Bill rubbed his face, looking every one of his 58 years. "I'm telling you to be careful, and to make damn sure you're right before we print anything. The Morrison family's lawyer has already called the publisher. They're talking about defamation if we suggest their daughter's killer might still be free." That evening, Emma met with Marcus Thompson, a defense attorney who'd agreed to look at John's case pro bono if she found enough evidence to support an appeal. They sat in a dim booth at a steakhouse near the courthouse, the kind of place where deals were made and secrets traded. Marcus was younger than she'd expected, early 30s, African-American, with the kind of intensity that suggested personal investment beyond professional interest. "My cousin went down for something he didn't do," Marcus explained when she asked why he'd taken an interest. "Different case, different state, but same story. Young black man, white victim, pressure to solve it fast." He'd reviewed the files she'd copied, and his assessment was blunt. The confession alone would be thrown out today. No lawyer present, interrogation techniques that border on torture. But in 1982, and with the racial dynamics, John never stood a chance. Emma's home answering machine had 3 messages when she got home that night. The first was from her mother, checking in. The second was from a number she didn't recognize, silence for a few seconds, then a hang-up. The third made her blood run cold. A distorted voice, clearly disguised. "Some stories are better left untold, Ms. Harris. The Morrison case is closed. Leave it that way." She played it again, trying to detect anything familiar in the voice, but the distortion was too complete. She thought about calling the police, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. If someone in law enforcement was behind this, going to the police would only tip them off about how far her investigation had progressed. The next day brought a breakthrough from an unexpected source. Emma had been trying to track down other residents from the building where the murder occurred, most of whom had long since moved away. But she found Eleanor Watts, now 73, living in a nursing home in Cicero. Eleanor had lived across the hall from Rebecca and remembered that night clearly. "I never believed it was that young man," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "I saw someone else that night, going into Rebecca's apartment around 10:30. White man, older, maybe 40. Looked like he belonged, you know. Nice suit, confident walk. I told the police, but after they arrested John, nobody wanted to hear about it." Emma asked if she could describe the man in more detail. Eleanor closed her eyes, thinking. Tall, over 6 feet, dark hair starting to grey. He had a distinctive watch, gold, very flashy. And he smelled like expensive cologne, the kind that fills up an elevator. This description didn't match anyone in the original case files, which meant either the police hadn't followed up on Eleanor's statement, or it had been deliberately excluded. Emma spent the rest of the day cross-referencing Rebecca Morrison's life, looking for men who might match Eleanor's description. Rebecca had been a graduate student in psychology at the University of Chicago, working part-time at a law firm downtown to pay for school. Her supervisor at the firm had been a man named Richard Brennan, who roughly matched Eleanor's description. Emma pulled newspaper photos from 1982. Brennan had been a rising star in Chicago legal circles. Now he was a judge. Her investigation had just become significantly more dangerous. The downtown law offices of Brennan and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower on LaSalle Street, a monument to Richard Brennan's success in the 12 years since Rebecca Morrison's death. Emma sat in the marble lobby, having made an appointment under the pretense of writing a profile about influential Chicago judges for the Tribune's Sunday magazine. Her tape recorder was running in her purse, the microphone positioned near the top, though Illinois was a 2-party consent state for recordings, which meant anything she captured couldn't be used in court but might still provide leads. Brennan kept her waiting 40 minutes, a power play she recognized and refused to let irritate her. When his secretary finally showed her in, Emma was struck by how closely he still matched Eleanor Watt's description, the years having been kind to him, his hair now silver but still thick, his build maintained through what was probably expensive gym membership and perhaps a surgeon's help. "Ms. Harris," Brennan said, rising from behind his massive oak desk, but not coming around to greet her, another power play. "I understand you're writing about Chicago's judicial system. I'm happy to discuss my public service, though I should mention I have a hard stop in 30 minutes. Emma smiled, pulling out her notepad, playing the role of the eager journalist. She lobbed him softball questions about his career trajectory, his most memorable cases as a prosecutor before taking the bench, all while studying his mannerisms, his tells. It was when she mentioned doing background research on all the firms he'd worked for that she saw it, a slight tightening around his eyes. "You were at Hartley, Madison and Klein in the early 80s, correct?" she asked casually. "That must have been a tragedy, losing that young paralegal. Rebecca Morrison, wasn't it?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Brennan's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to his watch, that same expensive gold watch Eleanor had described. A nervous gesture, perhaps. "Rebecca was a brilliant young woman," he said evenly. "A terrible loss. But her killer was caught and convicted. Justice was served." Emma nodded, making a note. "Did you know her well? Working together at the firm?" Brennan stood, the interview clearly over. "Ms. Harris, I've reviewed your work. The Riverside 3, other cases. You have a habit of seeing conspiracies where there are none. Rebecca's case was solved 12 years ago. I'd hate to see the Tribune's reputation damaged by publishing unsubstantiated theories." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. As Emma left, she noticed Brennan immediately picking up his phone, his eyes tracking her all the way to the elevator. That afternoon, Emma returned to the Tribune to find her desk had been searched, subtly but definitely. Papers were slightly out of order. Her locked drawer showed tiny scratches around the keyhole. Bill Crawford called her into his office again, his face grim. "The publisher wants to see you tomorrow morning, 9 sharp. And Emma, you might want to bring everything you have on this case." The pressure was mounting from all sides, but Emma had been through this before. That evening, she made copies of everything, storing one set in a safety deposit box and another with Marcus Thompson. If they wanted to shut down her investigation, they'd have to do it publicly, and that would only raise more questions. The meeting with the publisher, Harold Morrison, was even worse than she'd anticipated. It wasn't until she was sitting across from him that she made the connection, the same last name, the same patrician features. "You're related to Rebecca," she said. Not a question. Harold's face was stone. "She was my niece," he confirmed. "And you're dragging her memory through the mud, suggesting her killer wasn't caught. My family has suffered enough, Ms. Harris. This ends now." Emma felt her temper flare. What if they got the wrong man? What if the real killer is still out there, possibly in a position of power? Harold's laugh was bitter. John Carter confessed. The evidence was clear. This is about your hatred of authority, your need to see corruption everywhere because of what happened to your father. The mention of her father was like a slap. Emma stood, her hands shaking with anger. My father died trying to expose the truth. And the truth is that John Carter's confession was coerced, that witness statements were ignored, that your niece deserves real justice, not just a convenient conviction. Harold stood as well, towering over her. "You're suspended. Effective immediately. Clear out your desk. And if you publish anything about this case anywhere else, we'll sue you for theft of Tribune resources and defamation." Emma left the building carrying a cardboard box of her belongings, but her investigation was far from over. If anything, the resistance she was facing convinced her she was on the right track. Marcus Thompson was waiting for her at her apartment, along with someone she didn't expect, Ray Kowalski. The retired detective looked uncomfortable, but determined. "I've been thinking about what you showed me," he said without preamble. "There's something I didn't tell you." The night of the murder, Richard Brennan called the precinct, said he was worried about Rebecca because she hadn't shown up for work, but that call came at 8 a.m., and the firm didn't open until 9. How did he know she wasn't coming in, unless he knew she was dead? This was the first concrete evidence linking Brennan to the crime, but it was still circumstantial. They needed more. Over the next week, working without the Tribune's resources, Emma and Marcus dug deeper into the relationship between Brennan and Rebecca. They found a former co-worker, Janet Phillips, now living in Milwaukee, who remembered Rebecca being uncomfortable around Brennan. "He was always finding excuses to work late with her," Janet said over the phone. "She mentioned once that he'd made a pass at her, but she couldn't afford to lose the job. This was maybe a month before she died." They also discovered that Brennan's wife had filed for divorce just 2 weeks after Rebecca's murder, though the filing had been withdrawn a month later. The timing seemed more than coincidental. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. John Carter had continued investigating from prison, using the law library and corresponding with other inmates. He'd found someone, a former cellmate of another prisoner, who claimed that prisoner had been hired to stage a robbery at Rebecca's apartment, but had arrived to find her already dead. This prisoner, Danny Velasquez, had died in a prison fight in 1987, but his former cellmate, Tommy Chen, was willing to talk. Emma and Marcus drove out to Joliet to interview him. "Danny was small-time, B&E mostly," Tommy explained. "He said he got hired for this job, $5,000 to toss some girl's apartment, make it look like a robbery. But when he got there using the key he'd been given, she was already dead. He took some stuff to make it look good, but he was spooked. Said the guy who hired him was some big-shot lawyer, described him perfectly, tall, dark hair going grey, expensive watch. The plan to expose Richard Brennan required careful orchestration. Without the Tribune's platform, and with the threat of lawsuits hanging over her head, Emma had to find another way to bring the truth to light. Marcus had filed a motion for a new trial based on the evidence they'd gathered, but they knew the legal system moved slowly, and Brennan had connections throughout the judiciary. They needed public pressure, and for that, they needed irrefutable proof. Emma reached out to a contact at WGN-TV, a rival reporter named Sarah Kim, who'd been following Emma's suspension with interest. "You're telling me a sitting judge might be a murderer?" Sarah asked when they met at a coffee shop in Wicker Park. Emma laid out everything they had: Eleanor Watts's testimony, the timeline discrepancies, Brennan's suspicious behavior, Tommy Chen's statement about Danny Velasquez. Sarah was interested but cautious. "We need something concrete, something that directly links Brennan to the murder." The answer came from technology that hadn't existed in 1982. DNA testing had advanced significantly, and Marcus had successfully petitioned to have evidence from the crime scene retested. The cigarette butt Emma had noticed in the crime scene photos had been preserved, along with skin cells found under Rebecca's fingernails. The initial results were promising. The DNA didn't match John Carter. But to compare it to Brennan would require getting a sample from him, which wouldn't be easy. They decided on a risky approach. Emma would confront Brennan directly, wearing a wire provided by Sarah's news team, hoping to provoke him into saying something incriminating. It was dangerous, possibly foolish, but they were running out of options. Emma met Brennan at his office on a Friday evening, after his staff had left. She'd called ahead, telling him she had information that could damage his reputation and suggesting they discuss it privately. He'd agreed, which told her he was worried about what she might have found. This time, Brennan didn't make her wait. His office was dimmer in the evening light, the city lights beginning to twinkle beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Ms. Harris," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I thought I made myself clear. Your career is over. What could you possibly hope to gain from this?" Emma placed a folder on his desk, containing copies of everything they'd found. As he read, she watched his face change, the controlled mask slipping slightly. "This is all circumstantial," he said finally, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Maybe," Emma agreed, "but it's enough to raise questions. Questions about why you called the precinct before Rebecca's body was discovered. Questions about why witness statements placing someone matching your description at the scene were ignored. Questions about Danny Velasquez and the $5,000 he was paid to stage a robbery." At the mention of Velasquez, Brennan went very still. "You're recording this," he said, not a question. Emma didn't deny it. "The truth needs to come out, Richard. John Carter has spent 12 years in prison for something he didn't do. Rebecca deserves justice, real justice." Brennan stood and walked to the window, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was different, older, tired. "You don't understand what it was like. Rebecca was going to ruin everything. She'd recorded us, our encounters. She was going to the partners, to my wife. My career, my family, everything I'd built would have been destroyed." The confession, even oblique, was more than Emma had hoped for. But Brennan wasn't finished. "It was an accident," he continued, seemingly forgetting or not caring about the recording. "I went to reason with her, to offer her money, whatever she wanted. But she laughed at me, said I was pathetic. I just pushed her. She fell, hit her head on the coffee table. I tried to revive her, but it was too late, so I made it look like a robbery, paid Velasquez to muddy the waters further. When the police arrested that maintenance worker, I thought it was over. He confessed, after all." Emma's hands were shaking as she listened to him rationalize murder, frame an innocent man, and destroy multiple lives to protect his own reputation. "You need to turn yourself in," Emma said quietly. Brennan laughed, a bitter sound. "With what evidence? This conversation? I'll claim coercion, entrapment, my word against yours, and we know who the courts will believe." But Emma had one more card to play. "The DNA evidence from the crime scene is being retested. Your cigarette butt, your skin under Rebecca's nails. Technology has advanced, Richard. The truth will come out." Brennan turned to face her, and for a moment she saw real fear in his eyes. Then, surprisingly, something like relief. 12 years, he said. 12 years of seeing her face every time I close my eyes, of wondering when someone like you would come knocking. Maybe it's time. The aftermath moved quickly. Brennan didn't turn himself in immediately, but the recording played on WGN's evening news created a firestorm. The state's attorney's office, facing massive public pressure, ordered a full review of the case. The DNA evidence, when compared to a sample Brennan was compelled to provide, was a match. Within 6 weeks, John Carter was released from Stateville, walking out into a gray Chicago morning as a free man for the first time in 12 years. Emma was there, along with Marcus and even Ray Kowalski, who'd become an unexpected ally in seeking justice. The Tribune, facing public backlash for suppressing the story, not only reinstated Emma, but gave her a front-page byline for the full exposé. Richard Brennan was arrested at his home on a Wednesday morning, the same kind of grey Chicago day when John had been freed. He was charged with murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His trial would become one of the most watched in Chicago history, but that was still to come. For now, Emma stood with John Carter outside the courthouse where his exoneration had been officially declared. "Thank you," John said simply, the words inadequate for what she'd done. "What will you do now?" Emma asked. John looked at the city skyline, breathing in free air. "Live," he said. "Just live. Make up for lost time. Maybe help others who are where I was." He'd already been contacted by the Innocence Project, interested in having him work with them. Emma's investigation won her a Pulitzer Prize, but more importantly to her, it led to a review of dozens of cases from the early 1980s, where confessions had been obtained under questionable circumstances. 3 more wrongful convictions were overturned as a result. Harold Morrison never apologized, but he did establish a fund in Rebecca's name to provide legal aid for those claiming wrongful conviction. The system that had failed John Carter didn't change overnight, but cracks had formed in its foundation, letting in light where darkness had prevailed. As Emma walked back to her office at the Tribune on a warm spring morning 6 months later, she passed a newsstand where the headline read, "Brennan convicted, life without parole." As she thought about her father, about justice delayed but not denied, about the power of truth when someone is brave enough to seek it, her phone was already ringing with new tips, new cases, new injustices to expose. She answered it, ready for the next fight, knowing that somewhere, someone needed the truth to set them free.